Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the history of fishing in Morro Bay and get into a little bit about commercial fishing in Morro Bay. So first of all, we're going to be talking about fishing by Native Americans, and then we're going to get to discussion about early commercial fishing, modern commercial fishing, and then emphasizing throughout the term sustainable seafood, how we can be part of the solution to have less of an impact on the ocean and purchase seafood in more sustainable ways. So does anybody know what the two local tribes were that were located within San Luis County? There was two tribes actually that really crossed over right about Morro Bay. And if you look on this map here, we can see that we have the Chumash Native Americans and the range here down to about Ventura up to right about Morro Bay. And then we have the Selenian Native Americans, which extended along the Big Sur coast and over here to about King City, and this was the range. So we kind of had a little bit of an overlap here. So when we talk about the Native Americans in San Luis County or in Morro Bay, there was really two tribes that were in this area, and there were certainly some interactions between those tribes. Earliest records in this area date back to about 13,000 years. But one of the interesting things that we learned about on one of our other field trips is that there's not a lot of early evidence of some of this because the sea levels were so much lower back then. You remember how far out the sea levels were 10,000 years ago? This is about the last ice age, and a lot of water was trapped in ice caps and glaciers around the world. And they estimate that sea levels were about 200 feet lower, so maybe 6 miles out. The coastline 10,000 years ago was about 6 miles out. So that's one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of evidence of Chumash or Selenian Native Americans along the coast 10,000 years ago, is because their villages and all the different type of activities they would have done would be underneath a couple hundred feet of water now. But the Native Americans certainly harvested lots of seafood. That's why they're along the coast, because there was a tremendous amount of seafood to be harvested. It was a great supplies of food for them. And archaeologists have gone back and documented 76 different marine and freshwater species that they consumed. When we look at the top 5 marine species, there's sardines, shark, anchovy, ray, and senorita, which is a small fish that lives in kelp forests. Other notable species that they found evidence of is white sea bass, black sea bass, yellowtail, halibut, albacore, and swordfish. Now, while white sea bass, black sea bass, yellowtail, and halibut are all nearshore or coastal species, it's significant to see that they actually captured albacore, tuna, and swordfish also. And these swordfish, they are not nearshore organisms. Neither are albacore. Albacore occasionally could come within maybe 5 or 10 miles of the coast, but swordfish would rarely come inside of 20 or 30 miles. So certainly at some point in time, they were taking their canoes well offshore to target some of these species. This is actually a pictograph that a student of mine took near some caves in Lompoc, California. And if you can see the image here, this is a pictograph of a swordfish, right? So here's the bill here. Here's the pectoral fin. There's the dorsal fin coming back. Here's the caudal fin. So that's pretty amazing to see that the Native Americans were able to harvest organisms that far offshore, and swordfish are also quite large. It's not uncommon to see 500, 700, 800 pound plus swordfish out there. There's also evidence that they harvested marine mammals. Sea lions, seals, and otters were all amongst the marine mammals that they harvested. And of course, lots of invertebrates. Crab, lobster, abalone, lots of evidence of abalone harvesting along the coast. Different types of snails, limpets, mussels, oysters, clams, and urchins. All of these can be found in their middens that we find sprinkled up and down along the coast. And middens, remember, those are just Native American garbage dumps, right? These are just areas that the Native Americans were living, and they just threw out all of their leftover pieces of shells and whatever they were eating onto the ground. And anything that's really hard has been able to stand the test of time. That's why you see so many shells in there, because shells degrade very slowly, and they're going to be able to last a long time. Some of these areas you can also see dark soil and charcoal indicating that they have fires and things like that too. So how did the Native Americans go about capturing these seafood items? Well, they used nets, traps, harpoons, hooks. They would go out and wade around and pick and dig in the intertidal zone, and they would use some poison plants to actually poison or stun some of these fish. So when we talk about nets, there was a variety of different types of nets that they used. They may have used small little dip nets, small nets just to dip down in the water to capture the fish. But there's also evidence that they use something that's sort of like a beach seine. Now, a beach seine is a net that has weights on the bottom and kind of floats on the top, and you drag it through the water and entrap the fish as you drag it through the water. So this is limited to shallower waters, so you can only do this in waters that are shallow enough for you to be able to wade through. And certainly there has been good evidence documenting that they use these types of nets to be able to capture fish. They also may have used some modification of a gill net. Once again, a mesh panel that they were able to use in the water. They were able to ensnare fish as they drifted by. And some places along the coast and in estuaries, they find these rocks with grooves in them. And these were the weighted anchor stones for these nets. They also use different types of traps to either corner or entrap fish. Some of these maybe just look like baskets that the fish would enter in through a narrow end and not be able to get out the other side, similar to a crab trap or a minnow trap today. Perhaps they had areas along the shoreline where the fish just swam in through some sticks, swam into a confined area, and then couldn't find their way out. You can imagine how well this could work in a place like a Morro Bay estuary, whereas the tide came in, the fish would be scouting along the shoreline, swim into some little trap like this. So the entrance is right here. You'd swim into this area, then the tide drops out, and you end up getting trapped in this confined area. They also certainly would harpoon fish, especially in shallower water and in the tide pools and in the estuaries along the mud flaps. They would probably cruise along in these areas and have different types of harpoons that they would use to spear fish as they drifted through the shallows or walked along in shallow water. And there's also good evidence that they went fishing. So they would go out and catch fish with hook and line. And there's a lot of different examples of the different types of hooks that they used. Along the coast here, of course, with the abalone shells being quite abundant, they would carve and shape different types of hooks with the abalone shells. We could also see that they would use the natural seeps of oil along the coast, this tar that was along the coast from these natural oil seeps, to be able to secure these lures to their line. And there's also evidence that they had weights. These are fishing weights that would help take those hooks down to the bottom. And they have found many examples of these along the coast of these rounded out rocks with holes in the middle that they used as fishing weights. Of course, thousands of years ago, there was a lot of shellfish along the coast. And so the Native Americans would certainly go out during low tide periods. They would harvest abalone off of the rocks. They would cruise along through the mud flats and pick up oysters and dig down and harvest clams. And so there was certainly a lot of harvesting of shellfish. And when you look in the middens, this is what they find a lot of, are these shells. These don't move fast, right? They don't move hardly at all. And so they're quite easy to capture and are a great source of protein for anybody, much less the Native Americans at that time. There's also some evidence that they used a variety of poisonous plants. There's a plant called soaproot. There's also a California buckeye and the buckeye nuts that look like this. There's also a wild cucumber. And so they could use these different plants, put them into a confined area of water, and it would stun the fish. Now, most of this was most likely done in creeks, small streams, things like that, just because the amount of water that they would have to treat would be much more condensed. But it was possible that they could do this in tide pools and in confined pools in the ocean, and it could have worked fairly well to stun those species. So pretty interesting that people have been fishing along this part of the coast for quite a long while. The history of commercial fishing in California in general really began back in the late 19th century. most of this centered around San Francisco. And this was mostly because of the fact that there just weren't that many people in California at this point in time. The gold rush wasn't until 1849, and then before that, there just weren't very many people in California, so there wasn't a need for commercial fishing at that point in time. But as the gold rush started and moving into the late 19th century, there were a lot of people now in the San Francisco area, and so there was a need to be able to supply those people with different types of seafood products. Initially, there was not very many different types of fishing, mostly nearshore trawl, gill nets, and some hook and line fishing that was fairly close to the coastline. As we start in the Morro Bay area, we can see that the commercial fishing really started with abalone and oysters. Abalone and oysters were harvested primarily through rock picking, and some of it was harvested through diving. We can see these amazing pictures here of the literally tens of thousands of abalone that were harvested along the coast during this time. Up in this upper image here, this is literally a mountain of abalone shells, and here's Morro Rock here in the background. This image here is also from Morro Bay. So pretty impressive amounts of abalone that they were able to harvest. Now some of this went up to markets up in the Bay Area, but a lot of these abalone were actually dried and then shipped all the way across to Asia, primarily China, to export to those countries. The diving that they did at this point in time was hard hat or hookah diving. This is basically where you put a big suit on, and it's very heavy, and you go down to the bottom of the ocean. You're essentially just walking along the bottom of the ocean. You have a line. This is a hookah system, a line that goes into your helmet, and you're just breathing air from the surface as you're walking along the bottom of the ocean. So there was a lot of abalone back at this time. This is low tide, and these are all abalone. This is just crazy. But what else you don't notice there is there's not much algae, right? So these abalone are herbivorous. They're eating kelp and different types of algae, and there were so many of them at that point in time that there was hardly any algae around in the ocean because they were so efficient at grazing that algae. Why were there so many abalone at this point in time? Was this a normal amount of abalone that we were seeing during this period, or was this an abnormally high amount or high abundance of abalone that we were seeing out there? What do you think? What animal wasn't around at this point in time that likes to eat abalone that helps protect the kelp forest? All right, yeah, you guys know it's the otters, right? So the otter populations were very low at this point in time. They estimate that there was maybe 20 or 50 otters that were along the Big Sur coast, and these are really just the ones that they missed. These are the ones that the fur hunters didn't find in that remote section of Big Sur. And so because there wasn't otters around at this point in time, the natural predator of the abalone was absent within the ecosystem, and their populations just boomed at this point. So Morro Bay, if you don't know much about the history of Morro Bay, the Morro Rock out there, it is actually an island. If you look back at these old pictures, we can see that Morro Rock is off the coast, and we have water flowing in through the north side and water flowing around here through the south side. Now the main entrance was actually through the north side. But you could imagine with the swells and the winds coming in here from the northwest side that this was a very treacherous crossing for boats as they came into the harbor because of the waves breaking across that northern entrance there. So there was certainly commercial fishing that began in earnest by the 1930s. There was enough population both within the state and within the county to be able to support robust fisheries for sardines, ground fish, which are things like rockfish, lingcod, cabezon, but also salmon and albacore. Now, most of these boats fishing around Morro Bay area were fishing with either purse seines, trawl nets. They were trolling for the salmon and the albacore, and then for some of the ground fish, they could also have been doing hook and line. So there was a variety of fishing methods that were used at this point. But that harbor was still a very, very dangerous place to go in and out of. And if you want to build a jetty, where do you go to get the rock to build that jetty? Well, you just blow it up from the rock that's standing in the ocean. And so that's what they did. If you look at this image here, we can see that they blew up about 10% of Morro Rock. And they just went in there and dynamited this area, and they collected the big boulders from the rubble, and they created both the pit, the sand spit that goes across now connecting the rock to land, but also created the north and south jetties of the Morro Bay Harbor. They also used some of this material to go down to Port San Luis and build parts of the Port San Luis jetty. You can see from this image right here how far off to the east that Morro Rock used to extend. Morro Rock really stops right about in here now. So they blasted away and took away a tremendous amount of rock off of this area here. This was done from 1934 to about 1936 is when they closed this area off. Initially, going across to the rock, there was a bridge with a railroad that went across, but over time they filled it all in with all the rubble and rocks, and it eventually made it big enough and wide enough to where they were able to put actual dirt over this area. Something interesting happened in their late 1930s, early 1940s was World War II. And I don't know if folks know this, but Morro Bay was actually an area that the military used during World War II. So they actually practiced beach landing. This was one of the practice areas for the soldiers for the Normandy beach landing. And so there were soldiers stationed around the Morro Bay area for several years as they practiced landing these crafts on beach. Apparently some of the jeeps going through the dunes got stuck. They had a variety of tanks out there. You can see here's another landing craft coming on shore. And there's rumor out there that there are unexploded ordnance within the Sandspit area, that area between Morro Bay and Los Osos. And there's some theories out there that there could be still some unexploded ordnance out there. But I've never known anybody that's run across them, but it's certainly possible. Another interesting part of our local history was the fact that the only documented sinking of a ship along the United States coastline occurred right off of the Central Coast. And this was an oil tanker. It was the USS Montebello. It had just filled up with oil at the Port San Luis Pier, now the Cal Poly Pier, and it was heading north up to San Francisco. And it was heading up the coast, and a Japanese submarine sunk it right off of the coast of Cambria, and the boat sunk fairly quickly. Interesting side note about this is that they didn't know at the time how much of the oil actually leaked out of the ship. And so they went in about, I guess it was about 10 years ago or so, and they went down to that sunken ship area with an ROV, and they actually drilled holes throughout the hull of the ship to see if there was still oil within the ship, because they thought that after about 65 or 75 years that the integrity of the hull would be threatened and it could leak oil along the coastline. Well, they found out that there wasn't any oil in the ship, and that wasn't a problem. So as we move into the 1940s and 50s, we really saw commercial fishing increase quite dramatically within the Morro Bay area. There was a lot of boats in the area at this point in time. There was a lot of boats fishing for sardines. That was a big fishery, just like it was up in Monterey. And there was a lot of trolling boats. These are salmon trolling boats here. These boats back here are trawling boats, so they're dragging a net. Remember, the trolling is moving along with lures or bait in the water for salmon or for albacore. And so just like the rest of the world, fishing dramatically increased from about the 1950s until the late 1980s. And we saw a dramatic increase until about the late 1980s, early 1990s. And in Morro Bay, we saw seafood harvest peak at about 12 to 14 million pounds a year. And so during this time, the fleet of boats in Morro Bay started to become fairly large. There was quite a few commercial fishing boats. They were large boats, and at least the bulk of that harvest was from bottom trawling, those large nets that you drag along the bottom of the ocean. And a lot of the harvest that they were capturing and bringing to shore were ground fish, so rockfish and lingcod and organisms like that. So this type of fishery is really what we call a high volume, low quality price fishery. So they're catching huge volumes of fish. One of these trawl boats could go out in 2 or 3 days of fishing and bring back 20 to 30,000 pounds of fish. The fish isn't the best quality. They're catching so much of it that they really can't take care of it that well. And so they're not going to get very much for this fish. They're going to get 80 cents, maybe $1 a pound if the market's good. But bringing such a large quantity of fish means that you're still going to make quite a bit of money, right? If they're getting $1 a pound, they're bringing 30,000 pounds of fish. That fishing trip just made $30,000. But these boats did have high overhead. The boats were big, and boats get really poor gas mileage. Literally, they measure their gas mileage in gallons per mile. That's how poor of mileage they get. And these are big boats, so they have a large crew. Generally, there's a captain and probably 2 deckhands on the boat. And so even though they're making decent amounts of money, they have high overhead, and they have to make sure they go back out again as soon as possible to keep making money to pay for everything. Well, as we moved into the late 90s and early 2000s, we saw that the commercial fishing locally and throughout the world started having some major struggles, but it really hit Morro Bay particularly hard. And it bottomed out in about 2007 when only 700,000 pounds of seafood was brought in 2007. And so that's a tremendous drop in the harvest of seafood off the coast here, going from 12 to 14 million pounds, and within about 10 to 15 years, you're down below 1 million pounds of seafood. So looking at this graph here, going back into the 1990s, we see that we're getting 9, 10 million pounds of seafood, sometimes down around 6 million pounds. And then we hit into the late 90s and we saw some major struggles here. And it's that period in 2007 when we got down to about 700,000 pounds. So what the heck happened? Well, one of the things that occurred during that time was that the managers, the scientists, realized that we were definitely overfishing the ocean. And so it went from an open access fishery where you just needed to have a commercial permit and you could pretty much go out and fish for whatever you want and catch as much as you want. And scientists started to realize that this was not a sustainable model. Even though there was more and more anglers going out trying to capture fish, there was fewer and fewer fish that were being brought to the docks. And so increased regulations started to occur during the late 90s and early 2000s, and this certainly decreased the amount of seafood that the commercial fishers could catch. There was also rising costs at this point in time, and for some of these fisheries, it just wasn't cost effective for them to go out and capture them, so sometimes they wouldn't even go out to target certain species. And then, of course, as world markets started to expand and shipping began to become a little bit easier, there was competition from imports. So as U.S. fisheries, with their high costs, weren't able to compete with the foreign markets, there was less demand for the more expensive seafood. And then there was a change in customer preference. There was some of the seafood that was brought in wasn't the highest quality, and there just was a drop in demand for some of these different types of seafood just because customers started preferring to eat other types of organisms. But we've seen really a renaissance within the Morro Bay fishery since about 2007 or so. There's been this dramatic shift from this large fleet of large boats, primarily using the trawl boats and purse seine methods, to now we have a small fleet of fairly small boats that have a diverse array of fishing methods. One of these boats is generally not going to use one method of fishing. They're going to use a variety of fishing methods. And they're going to be fishing for multiple species of organisms. They're not going to specialize in just catching groundfish. They're going to be fishing for crab. They're going to be fishing for salmon. They're going to be fishing for live fish. And so they're really diversifying as much as possible. And these fisheries also catch a much lower volume of fish. So we shifted from that high volume, low quality, low price to now we're low volume. And because we're catching fish in such small numbers, we can take really good care of them. So it's a small volume, but you're getting a higher price because the fish are of such higher quality. So the commercial fishers are able to take care of each individual fish. Literally, they're catching them one at a time, bringing them over the side of the boat, Oftentimes they will cut the gills to bleed the fish and put them immediately into an ice slurry to cool them down. And in some cases, the fish are in such good quality that they can keep them alive. And when they do that, the price really goes up. So back in the trawl fisheries, they might get 80 cents to $1 a pound for these fish. If they're bringing them in fresh on ice, they could be getting $4 to $6 a pound. If they can bring them in alive, they're going to get maybe 10 to 12 to maybe even $15 a pound for some of these fish that they're bringing in. So it really changed what was going on with the local fishery. Now, these small boats, you don't have to have as many people on board, and your overhead's smaller because the size of the boats don't use as much fuel, and they're not going to have as much overhead. So the most recent data that I've been able to find was from 2016, and during that year, about 4 million pounds of seafood that was brought in, and it was worth $7.2 million. So we can see that the value of that fishery has gone up substantially. What does this equate to in local jobs? Well, there's about 200 direct jobs, and so there are 200 folks that are directly involved in the commercial fishing itself, but there's also hundreds more involved indirectly. You could think of these as the folks that work at the fish processors, the fish markets, the folks that work at the restaurants taking this fish in and preparing it. So there's lots of jobs that are indirectly tied to this industry too. There are 223 commercial vessels countywide, and that equals 5,000 plus trips per year out of the county. So this includes both Port San Luis and Morro Bay. When we look at the landings, as I mentioned before, we were 8 to 10 million pounds here during the 90s, as low as 6 million during certain years. Dropped down very low here in the mid 2000s, hitting the bottom there at 2007. And since that time, we've been slowly moving back up to now we're hovering between 4 to 6 million pounds of seafood a year. And this is probably in the sustainable range. So this 4 to 6 million pounds of seafood a year is probably in more sustainable range that could be harvested every year and not impact the local populations. When we look at the dollars value that are brought in with these fisheries, we can see that we're back to where we were in the 90s. So here we were hovering between $6 and $10 million or so, depending upon the catch during that year, and we're still hovering in that same range now. So it's rebounded. We see quite a few boats now within Morro Bay, these smaller boats specializing in different methods and different species, and there's a good value associated with the seafood that's brought in. When we look at the variety, when we look at the value of these fisheries based upon the different types of organisms, we can see that there's a lot of different types of fish that are brought in and the value of each type of organism. So this is over a long period of time. This is 1990 to 2016, so about 26 years or so of data. And we see that sablefish or black cod making up about a quarter or so. Spot prawn is a large percentage of the value, and these are worth a substantial amount per pound. The commercial folks get $10 to $12 a pound for those. Dungeness crab, you can see, has a lot of value. Chinook salmon is the salmon that's brought in along our coast. We have Dover sole, which is a flatfish. The market squid. We have swordfish here, has a pretty good value. Thorny heads is a bottom-dwelling rockfish, deep water rockfish. We got albacore tuna, and we got cabezon here. So a variety of different species that are brought in, and this is for a long period of time. And what's interesting is when you look at a more focused period of time, we can see how much this can change from year to year. So this is top 10 species that were brought in 2015, and we see, wow, it was a great Dungeness crab year. 47% of the landings were Dungeness crab. Sablefish, also big landings, and lesser amounts were the bottom fishes. Ooh, look at hagfish is coming in here, squid, and the spot prawns. Just 1 year later, right, a lot of these fisheries are naturally just quite cyclical. And we see over here in 2016 that Dungeness crab now only was 28% of the catch, but now sablefish was up to 21. It was a good squid year. Market squid was up to 10%. We had a good shrimp year too. That was 10%. Bottom fish here, and we can see spot prawns and several other species in that category. So the whole point of this is that we have quite a bit of variability from year to year. That just shows you how adaptable that the local captains need to be able to switch from one species to the next when one type of seafood is having a better year than another. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about mariculture in Morro Bay. In general, we've seen a huge growth in mariculture, and we've talked about this before in class. Our catch of seafood in the ocean, this blue down here is the wild capture. And so the wild capture of seafood, it peaked here in about the late 80s, early 90s, and it's actually gone down. This graph kind of shows it being steady, but actually we're going down about 1 million metric tons per year almost. And so we're seeing a decrease in the amount of wild capture seafood. But the green shows you that we're seeing a huge increase in aquaculture, right? Aquaculture is fish farming, mariculture. It all means the same thing. And what we're doing there is we're raising species in the ocean. We're farming species in the ocean. Do you know what species that we raise along the Central Coast? There's actually 3 species. All right. Yes, oysters. If you guessed oysters, you were correct, but also clams. The culture of clams has started recently within Morro Bay, and there's also an abalone farm up north of Cayucas. Oysters began to be farmed in the Morro Bay estuary back in 1923. Believe it or not, the San Francisco Bay Area was already so overfished at this point in time and so polluted that there weren't very many oysters to be harvested, and the ones that were left were so polluted that folks really didn't want to eat them. So they began farming oysters in Morro Bay back in the 1920s to be able to supply these bigger cities with the oysters that the San Francisco Bay Area used to produce. There used to be 3 companies in Morro Bay, but now there's about 2, and both of these companies have been around for quite a while now, probably 10 to 12 years at least. The Morro Bay Oyster Company is located a little bit further south in the bay off of Los Osos, and the other company is Grassy Bar Oyster Company, and they're located a little bit further north. So Morro Bay Oyster Company is kind of right off the mouth of Los Osos Creek, and the Grassy Bar Oyster Company is about right off the mouth of Chorro Creek. And it's important for them to be in areas that have some freshwater input that actually makes for better oyster farming, as oysters like more of a brackish water environment. The companies have to lease the bottom of the bay from the state. They lease about 15 acres of tidal flats from the state of California. And the state charges money for this, but they don't charge a lot, and they really want to encourage this aquaculture to be happening within the Morro Bay estuary. The oysters are filter feeders. They're molluscan bivalves, and they filter out the plankton from the water column. So they actually help improve the water quality in the bay when there's healthy populations of oysters. And so they really like to have the oyster companies in the bay. In addition to that, the oyster companies need to have really clean water to be able to harvest the oysters. So the oyster companies are constantly working with local landowners and with local government agencies to help improve the water quality of the bay, because the organisms that they are trying to grow and sell are dependent upon that clean water. They have about 12 or so employees. Some periods of time are a little bit busier than others, but they average about 12 employees a year for both companies. And they're able to harvest about 2 million oysters every year. So about 1 million oysters are harvested by each of these companies. Now the oysters grow pretty quickly, maybe quicker than you would think. A small oyster that you would have for like an oyster shooter, or a small barbecued oyster that's 1.5 inches or 2 inches long or so, that oyster is about a year, maybe a year and a half. If you ever get those really large oysters, sometimes Togdanzini's has those large barbecued oysters that are about 3 to 4 inches. Those ones could be 2.5 years or so, but the oysters actually grow pretty quickly out in the bay. Recently, the Grassy Bar Oyster Company has started growing the small little nut clams, or what we call steamer clams. You ever get steamer clams at a restaurant? And they had an experimental plot for years, but now they're starting to ramp up production, and they're starting to sell the quote-unquote steamer clams out of their facility. There's a couple different ways that they grow the oysters. The Morro Bay Oyster Company has floats attached to each bag, and they actually float their oysters at the surface, whereas the Grassy Bar Oyster Company has bags that are anchored towards the bottom. Now, there's a variety of reasons for doing it, the different methods. The Morro Bay Oyster Company feels like their oysters are a little bit cleaner because they're off of the bottom, they're not in the mud. Whereas the Grassy Bar Oyster Company has these buoys set up on some of their bags, which help roll them around constantly. And they feel like they get a deeper oyster, an oyster with a bigger cup associated with it, and that allows them to maybe have a different market for more of the oyster shooters. Once they harvest the oysters, they need to bring them onto the sorting trays, and the oysters grow at different sizes, right? Some of the oysters grow really quickly, other ones grow a little more slowly. So you might get a harvestable oyster in 8 months with some of them, but then other ones might need another 2 to 4 months to grow to get to that harvestable size. In addition, you constantly have to be moving these oysters around. If you just let them all grow together, they will literally grow together. When they make their calcium carbonate shell, the shells literally will grow together and form into a thick mass. And also when they're in these bags moving them around, that also cuts off the sharp edges of the oyster, and once again just makes for an oyster that's easier to handle and clean and makes for a better product. Here's a short video talking about the Morro Bay Oyster Company.
The seafood changes daily, and you're constantly wondering, what is the ocean going to yield? My name is Tim Opperly. I've been with Whole Foods for 22 years now. I'm the regional seafood coordinator for the Southern Pacific region. My job is to go out and to source and find great seafood. And I actually meet the fishermen and make that connection that way. So we have a face-to-face relationship. People don't realize that there's somebody out there actually standing on a boat catching a fish, one fish at a time. I had heard from a friend about this guy in Morro Bay that was doing oysters.
Water temp here it's in the mid to low 50s, so it might be warmer than the air. Yeah. I'm looking forward to this bath. This is the Morro Bay estuary. This is our office. This is our most typical size of oyster. It's basically a yearling. So every oyster that goes to the market passes through this table, it's all hand sorted.
I knew Neil for like a year. What do you do? And he's like, oh, I run the oyster farm. He called me up about a week later and started the crew. Everyone knows us, as the oyster boys. It's awesome.
You want to make sure that this mussel's cut, the oyster's clean, and then serve them cold. Perfect.
It's super sweet. It's got a creaminess to it as well. Just a beautiful oyster.
Being on this side of the bay where we have that nice freshwater input, we got lucky, and that actually translates to a sweeter oyster. We are able to control the freshness of our product, knowing that it came right out of the water that morning and that evening it can be on the dinner table. It's a small town, small family business, so we just keep it local. So working with Whole Foods is a new adventure for us. This is the first and only grocery store we'll be selling to.
We want them to expand at their own pace. Whatever they want to do is what they want to do. And we're going to help them the best that we can. And just making that connection, to support those communities, because this is a livelihood for people. And if we're not buying their fish, and if they're not taking care of it properly, then it's not sustainable for anybody, and the local factor will disappear. I love the ocean. It's just an amazing place to be. I've got a great job. I get to travel the world looking for great products, fresh fish, for our customers to enjoy.
All right, the other type of aquaculture that's done along the Central Coast is up north of Cayucas, and this is the abalone farm. The abalone farm started selling abalone back in 1974. They currently employ about 30 people at their farms. There's a lot of overhead costs and a lot of employees that are involved in the farming of abalone. So this facility is actually on land. So they have large pumps located out here in the ocean, and they suck water out of the ocean. They have large filtration system and huge pumps up here, and then they send this water throughout the entire farm. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of tanks that are part of this abalone farm. The abalone are herbivores. They're eating kelp. And so there is a boat that operates out of Morro Bay called the Ocean Rose. And essentially this is sort of like a lawnmower that goes out and it harvests kelp. Mostly what they harvest is giant kelp, the Macrocystis. And they go out and cut it down about 2 feet below the surface. And they raise it up onto the boat, bring it back into Morro Bay Harbor, and then they offload it onto dump trucks to bring up to the farm. Now they actually have to lease these beds from the state, but once again, the state doesn't charge a lot of money for this. The kelp is a very sustainable resource to harvest. I've mentioned this before, and you've probably heard about the fact that kelp can grow upwards of almost 2 feet a day during the middle of summer with lots of sunlight and nutrients in the water. So it's a very, very fast growing organism, and you could literally go in and cut off 2 feet below the water surface and come back a week later, and you couldn't even tell that you harvested that kelp. So it's a very sustainable type of food resource to feed these abalone. They harvest about 5 tons of kelp twice a week. So they take that ocean rose out twice a week and cut them off, the stipe. They put them in these bags, they lift them up, they bring them up into the farm. This is a big crane. The dump truck would park right here, and they offload these big bags of kelp into this holding tank. And then when you need to feed the abalone, they actually have to load them up into the back of a pickup truck. They use a square point shovel, and they chop up the kelp. And here's actually, this guy's feeding them right now. So they drive the truck slowly through all these tanks. There's literally hundreds of tanks spread out through this area. And there's a guy in the back of the truck throwing that kelp into each individual tank. So you can imagine 5 tons twice a week. That's a lot of feeding. You can understand why they have so many employees at the farm. So abalone grow much more slowly than the oysters. Abalone grow incredibly slowly. A 4-year-old abalone is finally able to be harvested. And take a guess at how much meat that we're going to get off a 4-year-old abalone. Guess how much? Yeah, I bet you didn't guess 1 ounce of meat. So 1 ounce of meat. So in this image here, this is looking at an abalone. This abalone here is probably about a year, maybe a year and a half old. This is actually a harvestable abalone. So this is about a 4-year-old abalone. And out of that abalone right there, we're only going to get about 1 ounce of meat off of that 4-year-old abalone. So they have to have a lot of abalone in captivity because they grow so slowly. You can only harvest so many at a time. And because you don't get a lot of harvestable meat out of a single abalone, they're going to be trying to harvest as many as you can every year because your overhead is so crazy high. The abalone farm harvests about 1 million abalone a year, and they have to charge a lot for each individual abalone or for each pound of abalone because there's so much overhead involved in the farm. You may know how much abalone sells for per pound. Unless you know about it, you probably never would have guessed that it goes for $100+ a pound. If you can find it, it's even hard to find abalone a lot of times. But quite often you could see abalone for $125, even $150 per pound. I tried to look it up on Amazon, and they actually didn't even have it available. You weren't able to purchase it, and there wasn't a price there at the time. Something else that makes abalone so expensive is the fact that their power bill is so high. If you know farmers or folks that have a well and a water pump, you might know that pumping water is very expensive, right? Water is dense and it's slow to move. And so when you pump water, it takes a tremendous amount of electricity to do that. So look at all these tanks here, right? These tanks continue on this direction for quite a ways. So they have to pump the water all the way up here. It flows through these tanks, and eventually it flows back down out into the ocean. And so much water is being pumped through the facility that their power bill is at least $50,000 a month, but it can even be more during certain times of the year. Another short video done by Whole Foods talking about the Cayugas abalone farm.
Abalone is native only to the west coast here in the U.S. It is a mollusk. It's distantly related to octopus and squid. It's a sea snail. My name is Brad Buckley, and I'm the sales and marketing manager here at the Abalone Farm in Cayucos, California. It has a unique flavor, a unique texture that's really unlike any other type of seafood.
Hey, Brad.
Hey, Tim, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Oh, working with Tim's been great. I was really excited to hear that Whole Foods was interested in making it available.
We really pride ourselves on being first to the market with something, and you know, this is really, really neat, and I think our customers are really going to like it.
Look at this one.
That's a good one there.
How fat he is.
Yeah.
At least somewhere between 5 and 6 years old.
The fun part of my job is talking to people that had the experience of going out and gathering abalone at low tide with their parents and their grandparents. Although you can't go out at the beach at low tide and gather the wild abalone anymore, we have abalone available and you can create that whole experience.
Extremely flavorful, mesquite flavor, just a tenderness to it that's really, really good.
We have a great local farming community. Everybody's interested in what everybody else is doing because everybody's doing something so unique and so different. The abalone farm started in 1968, so the idea was to grow it on a farm mimicking the wild tide pool environment and make it sustainable. Abalone is synonymous with California seafood. It's iconic on the West Coast.
All right, so unfortunately, the Cayucos Abalone Farm is shutting down. They actually sold their last abalone just a few months ago, and the main reason for that is competition from other parts of the world. There are some large abalone farms that were started up in Asia. Many of the abalone that were grown in the Cayucos Abalone Farm were shipped over into Asia, and as these abalone farms started up in these Asian countries, the Cayucos Abalone Farm just could not compete with the cheap labor and the reduced shipping costs because they had to ship the abalone alive, they had to overnight freight them, and so shipping costs were very expensive. So the abalone farm is going to be no longer producing abalone anymore. But word is that Cal Poly is attempting to take over the facility and use it as an aquaculture facility. So if folks are interested in aquaculture, stay tuned. You might be able to eventually take classes out at the Cayucos Abalone Farm. All right, the Morro Bay experiment. So what has happened locally that has really increased the sustainability of our local seafood? And as we mentioned before, we went from the peak catches here in the 1990s to 2007 when it hit the bottom of the market, about 0.7 million pounds. And what we saw during that time was the Nature Conservancy come in and purchase the trawl permits in the Morro Bay area. There were 3 different trawl boats operating out of Morro Bay, and they spent nearly $4 million purchasing these trawl permits, which is unusual for a nature group. This is a nonprofit group out there that's trying to protect the environment. And normally what they do is they buy land. They buy land and they help conserve the land. Oftentimes they'll turn it over to state parks or national parks or county parks, but they're involved in protecting land primarily. Well, they're attempting to do this in Morro Bay. Literally these trawlers that were scraping the bottom of the ocean, they were damaging the land. They were damaging the bottom of the ocean. And so the Nature Conservancy saw this as an opportunity to come in to purchase these permits and protect the habitat, protect the bottom of the ocean from this habitat destruction that was occurring from these trawling boats. So they spent about $4 million, and initially they were just going to sit on this quota. They were just going to say, okay, you know, we're protecting the ocean, we're conserving the ecosystem, we're going to help restore the Morro Bay fisheries through just protecting the habitat. But a lot of people were very angry. These boats had a lot of folks working on them. They brought in lots of seafood. There was lots of infrastructure. Gasoline was sold to these folks, fishing tackle, ice. People would buy the seafood and ship it to other places. And so there was a lot of money involved with these trawl permits that was just taken out of the community by the Nature Conservancy. So people were quite angry at them, to be honest, at first. And they said, hey, Nature Conservancy, if you're so smart, why don't you figure out how to do it a better way? And so they did. And so they hired a couple biologists that were involved with fisheries management, and they decided that to take the quota that they now owned and give it back to fishers. Now, these commercial fishers had to actually apply to the Nature Conservancy. They had to write an essay, so get good at writing those essays. And they had to apply to the Nature Conservancy to be able to fish under their permit. Now, what the Nature Conservancy said, okay, you guys can go out there and capture this seafood that we have permits to capture, but you have to use less damaging methods. They would still allow a trawl boat. So they still allow one trawl boat to continue to catch fish under their permit, but they have to use a smaller net, and they've mapped the parts of the ocean that have sensitive habitat, and they don't allow the trawl boat to go into those areas. But a majority of this quota went back to folks that are either using long line or using traps. And as we've learned about before, traps and long line are very sustainable ways to capture seafood. You have very low bycatch with both methods, especially with the traps, but also with the long line. You can release your bycatch if you do happen to get it. And the quality of the seafood being captured with those methods is the best quality. We consider this the sushi quality type of seafood that's brought in. And it's also alive. So if you have the capacity on your boat, you could have some large live wells and tanks on your boat. You could bring those fish back alive and make even more money. So this really revolutionized how fishing was done along the Central Coast, and now it's moved to other places. So we have management now that's occurring with local committees. These are local fishers that are on these committees, the Nature Conservancy, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the harbor directors. So this is moving the management from Sacramento at best, or maybe even Washington, D.C. at worst, and getting the local folks to actually manage the fisheries and do a much better job, hopefully, because they have a vested interest in what's going on. So another short video here describing the Nature Conservancy's effort to help change the way commercial fishing was done to more sustainable methods.
Fishing was kind of romantic. When I started fishing, you just went to the Fish and Game office, you bought your license, you could fish whatever was available.
Morro Bay has been a fishing community since incorporation and long before. The harbor has always been the heart of our community. And it brought a certain cultural aspect in too of a working class fishing village that you don't see much on the California coast anymore.
Fishing is our heritage. We've had fishing for 50, 60, 70 plus years, before that even.
Oh, this was just a picture of me when I was 20 years old unloading rock cod.
When I first came here in 1990, I was really struck by the characters of the waterfront, and everybody has a nickname, and you know, there's Slow Eddie and One Trip Dave, Fast Eddie, and he always called the environmental groups eco-wackos. So.
We talked about the background of environmentalists and the fishing industry sort of always fighting each other. You know, you'll hear the fishing industry talk about corrupt environmental groups, and you'll hear environmental groups talking about, you know, fishermen out there raping and pillaging our ocean resources. Well, if you want to go work with a fisherman, if you want to go talk to him on his boat, that sort of language isn't going to get you very far at all. The Nature Conservancy had to step back and take a look at the world from the perspective of the fishermen.
We heard what seemed like a crazy rumor at the time that some environmental group was trying to buy up a bunch of trawl permits on the Central Coast.
Nobody liked it. Fishermen were always individual by nature. You know, they did their own thing when they felt like it.
So when I heard about that, we got a hold of them and expressed some concern, you might say. I don't remember the first meeting being particularly warm and fuzzy.
In a small community like Morro Bay, there has been overcapitalization. The fishery's economic performance, its landings, had really decreased dramatically between about the mid-90s to the early 2000s.
When the Nature Conservancy came into town, things were kind of at the bottom.
If you looked at their business practices over the course of several decades, there hasn't been that much change. And for a lot of reasons, there's certain perverse incentives within management that are sort of hard to shake up.
I used to fish by myself on the boat there for a few years, and the decline of albacore and salmon in this area, the rockfish closures, It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't a situation where I wanted my kids to try and be involved. I kind of had hoped that they would get other jobs and do other things.
Being on the ocean's a lot of work, but at the same time, I mean, there's nothing better. Fishing was getting harder for guys to make a living, and he steered me away from it.
And so a lot of these guys were looking to get out of the fishery. They didn't see a very promising future here.
The train was getting ready to leave the station, and I could stand around and scream about it was wrong, or I could try and help, you know, make it be where it would work for our community. And so I met with Michael Bell, and he discussed the program a little bit.
Bill Blue and I have been many times told that, you know, why are you working with the enemy?
In this day and age, if you're a true fisherman, you should definitely be thinking about how you can manage your resource to where it's there the next year.
And what we found was that the threat for marine biodiversity in the Central Coast was almost exclusively relying on bottom trawling, the dragging of a large weighted net to catch fish on the seafloor.
In the course of fishing with bottom trawls, what often happens is that you can drive down the stocks of some of those more vulnerable species. They just can't withstand that kind of fishing pressure.
We did feel it had gone too far, and we wanted to see what advantages there were to diversifying how you caught fish. So one of the very simple things that we wanted to try was to take some of these permits that had always been used on bottom trawling boats and start putting them on boats that would be willing to use more selective ways of catching fish, like hook and line and trap fishing. Using that selective gear, guys were catching fish in really premium quality condition, and they started getting more money per pound.
If you took away our industry, there's a lot of people that'd be out of a job.
People see this fishery project as a place where we're trying to work with communities to improve both its conservation and economic performance.
It's working because we're working together, trying to accomplish a common goal.
When you join today, you'll help the Nature Conservancy achieve.
All right, I'm not supporting the Nature Conservancy in any way there. Sorry about that. But I thought that was a very good video that describes what has changed in Morro Bay. And it's really cool to see over the last 15 years how it's completely changed in Morro Bay. So this new business plan really is what's happening also, is that this is sustainable seafood. This really is. This is smaller volumes of seafood being brought in. It's higher prices because the quality is so good. And I have a picture here of Mark Tognanzini. He owns Tognanzini's restaurant and fish market there right on the Embarcadero. It's right across from the old Morro Bay power plant. And he really started this stuff back in the late 2000s. And he got into it for a different reason. He got into it because he was a commercial fisher. He was going out and capturing salmon and albacore, and then he was having to sell it to a middleman who then would make quite a bit of profit off of the seafood that he brought in. He's like, wow, that's crazy. I'm not making very much money doing this, and I'm working very hard. So he started selling the seafood off of his boat directly. So he was doing direct marketing at the time, really one of the first people to start doing this. And the first time he did this, he had 100 and something salmon on his boat. He sent out an email to as many friends as he could figure out, and they forwarded it to other friends. And the first day he sold his 120 some salmon within just a half a day. And he had a huge wad of cash in his pocket, probably 3 or 4 times more than he would have had otherwise. And he realized that this was the future. This is the way for the local small commercial fishermen to make good money. And so eventually he started his restaurants and fish markets, and he still does that type of seafood, right? He's buying it from the local fishers. He's buying very high quality seafood, selling it for a good price. But it's worth it to spend a little bit more for his seafood because the quality is so good. So that's the whole idea here, right? It's all about local, right? These are our local fishers. These are local businesses. They're fishing for our local species that are pretty healthy, right? Our local stocks of seafood along the Central Coast are pretty darn healthy because we're so far removed from the industrial fishing centers of Los Angeles and San Francisco. And really all the folks that fish along our coast, they're mom and pop or father and son kinds of businesses that are going out and catching fairly small volumes of fish. Now we just need the local customers to step up, right? So it's up to you now. It's up to people out there to realize that it's worth it to catch U.S. captured seafood And to buy that high quality seafood, you may have to spend a little bit more money to do that, but you can really help be part of the solution by supporting these local businesses and supporting U.S. businesses. So this can really make a big impact. I've been teaching about sustainable seafood for about 15 years now, and I've seen a huge change in how this has affected the market. There are restaurants now that will come out and actively say that the seafood on their menu is in the green column of the seafood watch card. And so that's the whole idea. If you continue to vote with your dollar, you're going to continue to really force more and more businesses to switch over to this type of seafood that's caught in sustainable ways. So if you haven't used it already, or if people that you know aren't using it or looking at it, check out the Seafood Watch Guide. Get the app on your phone, and this can really help you make more educated purchasing of your seafood by having the ability to figure out, what seafood is caught in sustainable ways and which seafood is more destructive to the ocean, causes habitat damage, and has huge amounts of bycatch. The Fishwise system is something that you could see at a few of our local grocery stores. Really, it's in places like Whole Foods, Fresh Market, and places like that. But once again, as more and more people ask about this, maybe we'll start to see it in Vons and Ralph's and many of the other larger grocery store chains. So this is definitely something that you can do to be part of the solution. Every purchase that you make, you're voting with your dollar, and you could certainly have a big impact on the future. And as you educate other folks, as you learn more about it, you can just continue that information to spread, and hopefully it'll just be another huge grassroots type of effort of bringing all of our seafood to a more sustainable level. All right, thanks. If you have any questions, you can always shoot me an email about this. We'll catch you next time.